Hello and welcome to this English clinic on To Kill a Mockingbird and how to be successful in the Literature Paper 1 exam. So, if you're listening to this in 2022, there is no section B, there's no anthology poetry. So you come straight into the exam. It's just an hour and 20 minutes this time. You do unseen poetry, get that out of the way, and then you've got To Kill a Mockingbird or Mice and Men if you're in that part of the year. We recommend you spend about 50 minutes on this section, really 5 minutes to plan, then 45 minutes to write. It's worth 40 marks, so it's actually the weightiest essay in terms of marks that you have to write for English literature. And you're given a choice of 2 questions, and I'll go through types of questions later in this, but it's usually a character, theme, maybe setting, maybe something evaluative. But here we go. So, here's a mark scheme. As you can see, you're marked on AO1 and AO4. AO1 is your knowledge of the text. So that's basically how well do you know the text. Can you quote from it? Do you know what happens in key chapters? But also, do you have an argument? Do you have an opinion about the text? So that's really engaging with the question. So you asked a question on Scout, for example, and you talk about, well, why is Scout an important character? You don't just tell us what your favourite moments are. You make an argument about why Harper Lee has used Scout. Why focus on the dark tale of Tom Robinson through the eyes of a child? That's AO1, and then you're also marked on AO4, which is the relationship between the text and the context. Now, just to tidy up this one for you, it says on the mark scheme they're both worth 20 marks. However, we've been told by the exam board that doesn't mean you have to write 50% on the text, 50% on the context. They have said AO1 and AO4 are both worth 40 marks. However, structure of your essay should be 70% about the text and 30% about the context. Very roughly. The exam board have said this is not a literature essay. This is a literature essay, not a history essay. This is a literature essay, not a history essay. So just because it's worth half the marks, actually it doesn't have to be half the number of words you write in your essay. They really want to see you leading with the text. So when you write about this, your paragraph should be structured with points about the text, ideas about the characters, the themes, definitely Harper Lee's message, and then link to context. You should never be starting a paragraph with context because that would make it a history essay. So let's talk about the types of question you can get. Explore the significance of a character in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. It could be Scout, Jem, Dill, Atticus, Tom Robinson, Calpurnia. And your teacher should have given you a list of past paper questions, which actually even include the importance of the Yules, or even just the importance of Maella Yule. It's a big book, 320 pages. Don't feel like you have to write about everything. The exam board like it when people are nice and specific and they focus right on just that character. They don't try to tell us absolutely everything. So if you get Calpurnia, really just focus on the bits where Calpurnia is mentioned. Don't worry too much about sections of the book where she's not there. Explore the significance of a theme in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Here are some suggestions of themes: innocence or knowledge, justice, injustice, growing up, friendship, fear, horror, prejudice. And really do focus on that theme. In the mock, one of the questions was about inequality. And a lot of people wrote about injustice. Now, injustice is a type of inequality. The injustice experienced by Tom Robinson, by the black community, that is part of inequality. But inequality is found more broadly throughout the novel. So a lot of people kind of tripped up because they didn't talk about class inequality with, say, the Yules, for example, and the treatment of the Yules, and Aunt Alexandra's attitude towards class as well. So really do focus on what that question is. Don't answer the question you'd like to answer. Do answer the questions in front of you. And if in doubt, make sure you're consistently name dropping that keyword. So if you get a question on courage, for example, make sure every paragraph has that word courage, courage, courage. So it's very clear what you're saying is relevant to the question. The last 2 types of question are explore the significance of setting in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, I've just written a couple of settings there for you. There are 3 introductions to make them. I believe that's roughly pages kind of 1 to 3, page 144, and I think page 285. And they introduce us to Mako, and each time the introduction gets darker and darker. So the first introduction is very nostalgic, and then the latter ones get darker and darker. We hear about the experience of even Native Americans. I mean, talk about inequality. There's about 3 references to Native Americans across the whole text, which make it clear that America was founded on the persecution of Native Americans. So there's inequality in the blood, in the root of the country. And the last question is a bit of a, I think these questions are great. It's an evaluative question. So you're given a statement and you're asked how far you agree. Tom Robinson is the most important character in To Kill a Mockingbird. How far do you agree? And so I've written here, you'd have to develop the question like this. Explore Tom Robinson, because they've talked about him in the question. Then develop the question by exploring other characters you could argue are of equal or greater significance. And then you might have different characters have appeared more significant in the 1960s compared to today. So, Scout, for example, might have been very important in 1960s to bring on board a predominantly white audience, but is Scout as important today as she was to a 1960s reader? So that question, in Evaluate 1, that's just one type of evaluate question. It's not always going to be about, a character. It could be asking you to evaluate a theme. It could say, to what extent is injustice or injustice is the most important theme in the novel? How far do you agree? So those questions there, they're hard because you need to be confident at arguing. You need to really stick to your guns, have a really well thought through argument. But really, none of these questions are kind of easier or harder than another. I mean, you could argue that a character question is the easiest kind of question. But if it's not a character that you're particularly fond of writing about, then that makes it a hard question. Whereas if it's an evaluate question on something you find particularly interesting, then it's worthwhile. So that breaks down the 4 different types of questions. You can actually use this slide to help make your own practice questions. And the best thing you could do is lots of practice planning. Before you start writing, always make sure your argument is focused on this. What is Harper Lee's message? It's much easier to write about this text if you write about it as a didactic text, as a preachy, teachy text with a message for the reader. So I often work with my students on essentially the central message is to do with prejudice. It's to do with the treatment of African Americans in society. It's to do with the mistreatment of them, and it's to do with highlighting how if you're a white middle-class individual like Scout, it's easy to actually grow up blind to the injustice that you see all around you. And through Scout, we see her learn, and therefore we in turn learn about the injustice in society. But it's worth spending a good 10-15 minutes at one point in your revision. Break down what Harper Lee's message is. What does the book mean to you? Why do you think it's an effective bit of literature? Break that down into one sentence that's really punchy, that you can put into your introduction, because that'll really lift your essay and really make it clear you're very, very sharply focused on what the writer is trying to do. You should always be thinking about, actually all of these texts, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Inspector Calls, To Kill a Mockingbird. You should always be thinking, what is this writer trying to communicate to us? The characters are merely vessels used to help communicate their message. So you've walked into the exam, you've looked at the exam questions, you're given a choice of 2 and you pick the one that you like. And then this is how we structure our essay. So we do an introduction. This is a 1 or 2 sentence introduction that just introduces what the text is about, what is Lee's central message. Ideally mention a bit of context in which it was written, and then answer the question with a bold conceptual idea. I want you to tell us your idea and don't tell us that we need to read on. Never say, in this essay, I will explore this, this, and this. Just tell us. You've got a question on the significance of Scout, and so you jump straight in by saying, Scout is a particularly significant character because it's through her eyes and through her growth we learn about, we learn Harper Lee's message about the injustice and prejudice inherent in American society. So, you want to jump in with that. Those are the ingredients of a good introduction. They can happen in any order. Some teachers will say jump straight in with the answer to the question, but I would strongly recommend have an introduction that makes it clear you understand what the text is about, when the text was written, and a bold conceptual idea to answer the question. Your main body is 3 paragraphs that answer the question from different angles. So that can be walking away in a linear fashion through the text, beginning, middle, end. It can also be it can also be 3 themes or 3 characters to explore across the text. Instead of zooming in and analysing language, I instead would like to explore the effect on the reader and how it helps Lee convey her message and link to context. There is no AO2 awarded on the mark scheme, so you don't need to zoom in on language, you don't need to unpick an interesting metaphor. In fact, when it comes to quotes, this is a closed book. You won't have the book with you, so you do want to have a good number of quotes up your sleeve. But the most valuable thing you can do is just really describe in detail what happens in particular moments, particular scenes, and then explain to me or your reader, your examiner, explain why it is that it is so significant. So, for example, if you had a question that was on well, let's go with injustice, for example. One type of injustice that we see in the novel is Tom Robinson, and obviously his trial is a wonderful example of injustice because he is proven to be innocent in every single way. In fact, Atticus even points out the real perpetrator is Mr. Yule, and yet Tom Robinson is still sentenced to death. And so that would be a nice moment to focus on in the text. However, if I wanted to focus on another element of injustice, it might be interesting to focus on the fact that the novel ends with an element of injustice. Quite controversially, it ends with them deciding not to prosecute Boo Radley because for killing Bob Yule, because it would be unfair on Boo Radley. So you could make a really interesting argument that there is injustice actually used by Hec Tate and by Atticus to actually sort of get the result that they want. That's a very, very controversial idea, but I mean, nonetheless, they don't take it to trial at the very, very end of the whole thing. In conclusion, different teachers teach conclusions in different ways. Some of your teachers may say in your conclusion what you should do is mention the things that you haven't been able to mention in your answer so far, to mention that actually the debate continues. I actually think it's quite a good idea to talk about 20th century or 21st century context in a conclusion, to talk about how this text echoes through time and how it's still relevant today. That's quite a nice way to conclude, making a reader sort of think about, well, why do we read this text 60 years after it was printed? But in your conclusion, I'd say return to your initial argument and sum up your idea. So reread the question, reread your introduction, and then really make sure you squarely link your argument back to the question and to Harper Lee's message to her reader. This is very important because essays are linear things. Examiners are reading very, very quickly, and it's possible you've been writing quickly and you've not been clear. And so if you've kind of waffled a bit in the middle of your essay, but then you have a very clear conclusion that links back to your overall argument, set out your bold conceptual idea in your introduction, then the examiner definitely knows you've answered the question because I can see it here in the conclusion. So do make time for that conclusion. It's only in literature essays that you need to do conclusions. In language, it's more kind of answery and more about language analysis, but in literature, conclusions are a really, really valuable thing, and definitely you want a good conclusion if you're aiming for a grade 9. So I've planned out an essay for you here. This is an essay I planned on the significance of gem. In the blue boxes at the bottom of the page, you'll see essentially what my success criteria is, my little ingredients list for what goes into a good introduction. So here's what I would put in for a question on the significance of gem. Harper Lee's text highlights the racial inequality at the heart of American culture. Through the text, we see Jem grow from being a boy to becoming a young man. We see how he is shaped by his environment through the way he reacts to key events. Ultimately, he is part of the bigger theme of innocence destroyed. Now, that's not my introduction, that's just notes I've written down for my introduction. I would add a little bit more detail to make it a nice, solid introduction. That's what I would go for. Jem is about, he's part of that theme of innocence being destroyed. My first paragraph will focus on this. Jem is a Mockingbird character. He is innocent at the start, but that innocence is taken from him as he learns that the small town of Maycomb isn't as pure as he thought it was. So to fulfill this paragraph in a full essay, I would have to write about Jem, in one paragraph, I have to write about how Jem's presented at the beginning and then how he's presented at the end. So I would kind of talk across the whole novel in just one paragraph. You could do a paragraph on him at the beginning, a paragraph on him in the middle, and a paragraph on him at the end. That would also be appropriate. But the idea of talking across a whole novel in each paragraph, it creates a much more sophisticated argument, which would lead you towards a grade 9. My second paragraph would be this. Jem allows Lee to explore issues to do with courage. When he is young, Atticus is keen for Jem to learn that courage isn't always a man with a gun. It is through Jem that we experience the horrible racism of Mrs. Lafayette de Beauce, yet learn that courage comes in all shapes and sizes. And then we actually see him being courageous at the attempted lynching of Tom Robinson, where he stands up to Atticus and he refuses to go. So we see him learn about courage as we go through the whole thing. So that first paragraph, Jem is a Mockingbird. We learn about innocence destroyed through him. Second paragraph, through Jem we explore the theme of courage. Third paragraph, through Jem, Lee is able to explore the theme of masculinity. Atticus is presented as a strong liberal hero, yet it takes both Scout and Jem a long time to recognise the strength and bravery in their father. Jem goes through parts of the novel where he's angry at his father, sections where he's proud of his father, and towards the end of the novel, Jem's language and demeanour even mirrors Atticus to show that he is growing up to be a progressive liberal, just like his father. So, I've divided this essay into 3 themes. Theme 1, innocence. Theme 2, courage. Theme 3, masculinity. And then I conclude. I've got the whole plan here if you want to screenshot it. But I then conclude with this. Although Jem and Scout together represent the pure, innocent heart of America, tainted and destroyed by the cruelty of America, Jem is also used as a shadow of Atticus to show that having the courage to do the right thing at the right time is something all young boys should aspire to be when they grow up. So that conclusion, it's not just repeating what I've said before, it's saying, well, this is the ultimate effect on the reader, that we're supposed to see Jem essentially as a young Atticus, or an Atticus of the future. As a little gift to you, I've also planned an answer here on the importance of Scout in the novel. And so here's a little plan. I wrote this in time conditions, and it gets 38 out of 40. And I'll give you my feedback at the end about why it doesn't get the full marks. But here's my plan. Introduce the novel context, answer the question. Paragraph 1, Scout represents the death of innocence. Paragraph 2, through Scout we learn about justice and injustice. And paragraph 3, through Scout we learn about attitudes to women and class in the 1930s. And in conclusion, how is Scout central to Lee's message to the reader? I'm not going to read this to you. So if you want to pause the video in each of these slides, you can go through and have a read, or you can screenshot it and read it in your own time. So this is my introduction and first paragraph. This is my second paragraph on injustice and justice. And this is my third paragraph about femininity. And here's my conclusion. Now, the feedback that I was given by a teacher I had mark it to make sure that I had written something of a good standard was just I really could do with a few more quotes. So really put time into memorizing quotes. Describing key moments and key scenes is absolutely fine in this. They know that it's a closed book thing, the examiners, when they mark it. But having a few more quotes up your sleeve is always a really good way of proving to the examiner you know the text inside out. Here is a slide on key context. So there's lots of context, but this, I would say, these are the sort of 7-8 points that are most important to know. Written in 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. And that includes things like African Americans wouldn't get the vote until 1964, or wouldn't get civil rights until 64, voting rights until 65, and equal housing rights until 68, And in some states, you couldn't even marry between black and white Americans until 1970. And so that's what's quite interesting about the miscegenation laws, the idea of rules against black and white families, like Mr. Dolphus Raymond, for example. That was as late as 1970. The book is set in 1933 to 35, and it's during the Great Depression, so it's a time of great poverty. There's a tremendous amount of injustice. The trial of Tom Robinson mirrors the trial of the 9 Scottsboro boys in 1931. These were nine young men, some as young as 14, who were accused of raping 2 women on a train carriage. But it transpired that actually they weren't even on that train carriage, they were next door, and no rape actually took place. And in the appeal of the court case, the women actually recanted their testimony. They said it was all made up and they wanted to have it deleted from the record. But the judge refused to have that done. And so many of these men spent 15 years in jail, many of them on death row, until they were eventually released. So the idea of injustice in the courtroom in the 30s is a direct link to the Scottsboro boys. The decline of the Old South versus progressive liberal values. Aunt Alexandra represents the Old South. You know, the Finch family. The Finch's Landing is an old plantation house. This is an old aristocratic family. What's really interesting about Harper Lee using Atticus as this kind of liberal hero figure is Atticus is to the manor born. He comes from slave owner money. He grew up in a plantation house. Slavery ended in 1865, and Atticus is about 50 by the time the events of the book take place. So Atticus was born 15 years after the end of slavery, but his family definitely would have benefited from it. So it's an interesting choice that Harper Lee has basically picked someone who really should be pro Jim Crow laws, someone who really should be pro segregation because of his heritage and his background. And they make him the most liberal character in the book. Interestingly, he moved away from Finch's Landing, as did Uncle Jack, who moved to Boston, which is in the north, and he became a doctor. Aunt Alexandra remained behind, and she therefore keeps these old Southern values, and she is very unhappy about Atticus representing Tom Robinson in the court, because she thinks it's very bad for the family name. Segregation and Jim Crow laws. Lynching, always good to know. Over 4,000 black men were lynched between 1915 and 1940. When the jail mob arrived outside Tom Robinson's jail, this is what the reader should recall. Interestingly, lynch culture tended to actually be quite publicly attended. Those 4,000 lynchings are just what was recorded, and lynchings often happened with like a almost festival-like atmosphere. In the middle of the day, families would come out, the whole town would come out to lynch. And so what happens in the book is actually somewhat sanitized. The idea of it being a night lynching, clandestine trying to lynch him. What we can imagine, though, is that if they had been successful in lynching Tom Robinson, they would have left him lynched in the town square so that in the morning everyone would see. That would be a very common thing. You didn't kill someone quietly to send a message to the black community. You killed them quite publicly. Emmett Till was lynched in 1955. He was 14 years old, and he was lynched for allegedly whistling at a white woman. So this book was written in 1960, just 5 years before there were still lynchings going on. In fact, there's evidence of lynchings going right up until the 1990s in America, and the George Floyd murder in 2021 has been referred to in court as an example of a modern-day lynching. So lynchings are still very much apparent. A lynching is an illegal killing of someone for assumed criminal reasons. So a murder is not a lynching. It's when you take the law into your own hands as a vigilante and have someone executed. That is what a lynching is. That's what happened to Emmett Till. That's what happened to Tom Robinson. That's what happened to George Floyd. Next one down, fear of miscegenation. This is a great word to know. This means the white community's fear of the mixing of the races. It's part of what's also called the one-drop theory, the idea that if black and white people marry and have children, even if those children appear white, then they are classed as black. And even if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black. It's a horribly racist view that unfortunately in small communities still exists today, and it's called miscegenation, or to be really, really clear, it's called the fear of miscegenation. Interestingly, in the novel, in terms of inequality, Tom Robinson, a black man, was sentenced to death for having sexual relations with Mayella Ewell, which we know didn't happen. However, Mr. Dolphus Raymond, who is a white man, has a black wife, and the town turn a blind eye to him. So in terms of inequality, if it's a black man and a white woman, people try to lynch you, and you find yourself in court. If it is a white man and a black woman, people think it's distasteful, but they don't lynch you. So that gives you this idea of sort of social inequality and this double standard between attitudes towards black Americans and white Americans. And the last bullet point: excessive brutality of armed officers and the law against Tom Robinson. So just think about Tom Robinson for a second. Before he was in court, there was an attempted lynching against him. He was then in court and should have been found innocent, but was found guilty. Even Jem, a child, worked out he definitely should have been found innocent. And then afterwards, he was shot 17 times trying to escape. And it says, they said. Atticus doesn't really push back on this very much, possibly because he's, Scout is there and he doesn't want to alarm her. But Tom Robinson has one arm. He's running for a fence that is built to hold in prisoners, and so therefore it's going to be impossible for him to get over it because it's got barbed wire at the top of it. And he is shot 17 times. The guards would have been armed with either revolvers or rifles, and so to shoot 17 times means either a lot of people shot him or people shot and then reloaded. But you don't need to shoot someone 17 times in order to stop them climbing over a fence. It wasn't they shot at him 17 times and they hit him once. They hit him 17 times. So I would say if you make that argument quite clear, you can describe this as being like a firing squad. It's something very suspicious about his death. And I've written here, the death of George Floyd and countless black Americans is echoed in this narrative. So how do we do our revision? Here's a slide earlier from questions. You can zoom on in it or go back and screenshot it from earlier. Practicing planning is the best type of revision you can do, and each plan should include the following: Lee's message to the reader, 3 different angles, so that's either beginning, middle and end, or 3 different characters or 3 different themes, depending on what the question is. References to the text, so that's description. You're going to want to put page numbers in, not for the examiner, but for you, for your own. If you're doing a practice plan, put in page numbers to help you when you're then revising from your revision notes. And quotations. Like I've said before, really invest time in memorizing quotations. You might want to make flashcards where you've got like a chapter and a page on one side and then the quotation on the other side. And then connections to context as well. Each paragraph should be about the text first, and then a little link to context towards the end of the paragraph. You might want to screenshot this, but this is your revision checklist. Have I read the novel? Have I reread the novel, cover to cover? Feel free to use an audiobook. You may, and I strongly recommend using an audiobook and just to listen to the second half, just listen to the trial. That might help you really get those quotes into your head. Have I annotated key pages in every chapter? If not, use the key pages document to help you annotate. I've shared this with my students, and if you haven't got it, ask your teacher. And there is a document floating around that has what I believe are the key pages that are worth annotating. Can I write down in one sentence the key message of Lee's novel? Have I drafted a short introduction that can be adapted to suit most questions? And you'll want to screenshot this or make a note of this. These are the key characters you'll want to have planned an essay on. And ideally, you'll want 6 quotations in order to help develop an essay on each of these characters. Have I planned an essay on exploring how Lee uses each of these themes? Again, 6 quotations. For a theme, remember, you'll probably want to either pick moments in the text that apply to the theme or characters. So the Mockingbird motif, for example, you might want to do a paragraph on Scout, a paragraph on Tom Robinson, and a paragraph on Boo Radley. That would be a really nice way to structure that essay, because you'd hit very different things as you go through the whole piece. Whereas, say, an essay on courage, for example, you might want to focus on courage isn't a man with a gun, when the children are very excited about Atticus teaching them how to shoot, followed by courage being a lesson that Jem is taught through Mrs. Henry Lafayette de Bose, and then finally maybe the courage of Atticus standing up to injustice and doing the right thing towards the end. Here's a little reminder of those key moments of context. You might want to make a screenshot of this and make sure you've got this to make notes on for your homework and your revision. And finally, I've put together an absolute load of resources on our revision podcast, which is Serpent English Lit. You can either follow this URL or just go onto Google and Google the phrase Serpent English Lit podcast and then scroll through. There's not only stuff here on To Kill a Mockingbird, but there's stuff on Macbeth, there's stuff on Inspector Calls as well, and there's more stuff being added every term. There's, I think, about 9 hours worth of To Kill a Mockingbird content on there. So if you're stuck at all, do go back and listen to these. Okay, well, best of luck to you, and get revising. Thank you very much.